Michaele Harrington has been a college educator since 1997. She has taught at the Maryland Institute College of Art, at Baltimore City Community College, and for the past 11 years at Montgomery College's Rockville campus. She earned her Bachelor's of Fine Art from the Massachusetts College of Art and Design in Boston, and her Master's of Fine Art degree from MICA in Baltimore. At Montgomery College, she has taught courses in figure painting, abstraction, two-dimensional design, and color theory and applications. She has now completed fellowships with the Center for Teaching and Learning in 2008 and with the Smithsonian Faculty Fellowship in 2011. Professor Harrington is also a practicing artist, having exhibited work and won awards in a number of prestigious national juried exhibitions.
My semester I divide into two halves. The first half of the semester is the mechanics of learning to put paint down on paper, learning to compare the colors, seeing how light creates colors. So, I begin with one-dimensional color, which is light, and we look at a little bit of physics and a little bit of chemistry and how does light fall out of these. And then we move to pigment and dyes and discuss harmonies and contrasts and all of the other things that artists talk about when they talk about color. And then we move on to the biology of color. How does this thin little tissue at the back of our eye create this three-dimensional world that we see all around us? And from these three aspects of color, we can then look at color space and how space is created both on a two-dimensional surface for a painting. How do we create this illusion? But also how we interact with the world around us. So the first half of the semester is pretty basic. It's dull, but I try to make it as interesting as possible. And then in the second half of the semester, we get into the more interesting aspects of color, the things that are not cut and dried, but have the potential to really make life what it really is. And so it's the psychology of color, how we use color symbolically to mean things. We do it in religious practice. We have liturgy that is color-coded. We do it in many different cultural venues. We do it to organize our lives. We have colored folders for different file drawers for different sorts of things. We use false color imaging when we're looking, or when, I should say, astronomers, for example, are looking at Chandra telescope images, which are white little dots, but by discretely taking out little pieces of data points and grouping them by color, you can get three-dimensional images in color of galaxies and nebula and everything else that give you information that you would never have otherwise. Fashion, textiles, the color of the tables, the colors of rooms. Color pervades our lives, and what I try to bring to my students is the fact that color is an intrinsic part of their lives that they've been taking for granted, but they'll never take for granted again when they're done with my course. We talk about interior design. I give my students a basic, quick and dirty way to decorate a room and the theories on how to do that. And so the women in particular are really excited about this. And then we talk about architecture because, again, it encompasses those three areas from way back in the beginning. How does light affect architecture? How do the intrinsic colors of the materials play into architecture, or are they embellished? Do we decorate the surface? And then again, the symbolism of architecture. We can create symbolic spaces, ritual spaces, and color plays a factor in that too. So that being said, where am I going to put racial identity? Well, it's clearly going to have to be in the psychology of color section. And how am I going to do it? Well, that's debatable. I consider this a work in progress. Race had to be put late in the semester. Unfortunately, putting it late in the semester did not give me much time to really develop my curriculum around it. So ideally, it should have been the very last project in the semester where they could have taken everything that they had learned and then apply it to this one project and produce something that would have been really nice. Unfortunately, I didn't have that option, and it had to come sort of towards the beginning of the second half of the semester. So my students and I were struggling with this whole thing. It took longer than I intended for it to take, but we learned some new technologies. We did some funky things that we wouldn't have done otherwise. And they put together, some of them put together videos of what they did with their projects. So what I wanted to title this was The Color of Brutality, because it introduces the idea of racial identity in the 21st century into the theory class. But again, these flat comparisons of color doesn't do much good. I've covered this, so I'm just going to skip this slide. We began, first of all, by going to the museum and looking at race. And we went to 3 different exhibits. We went, first of all, to the Hall of Human Origins to find out whether there really was such a thing as race. And the students really loved it. Some of them brought their families with them. And this was one of those things that they said, I'm bringing my friends back here. This is a great place to go. So they were examining the biological validity of distinguishing between races. Were there differences between races? What's this DNA thing all about? Looking at Neanderthals and Cro-Magnon and humans and seeing the connections and how we're really the same race. Then we went upstairs and we went to Race, Are We So Different?, which was a fantastic exhibit. I had been looking at the website for a long time and playing with it, and was hoping that my students would enjoy it too. I particularly liked the face on the poster because there isn't a single white image there. It's all other races, so to speak. And to me, it was a very powerful example of, yeah, we look different, but are we really different? So during their visit there, I wanted them to critically consider what was being presented, the history of race, the way race is used in society to hold people back, the way there are economic and educational ramifications to this whole racial idea, and to consider the validity or the invalidity of race as an excuse for limiting a person's or a group's options in life. Oops, went backwards, sorry. All right, so then the third place we went across the street. This was a long day for all of them. And we went to the National Museum of American History to the For All the World to See exhibit, Visual Culture and the Struggle for Civil Rights, which really took us into the African American experience in the United States, from slavery through to the current times, and the ways that slaves were dehumanized and kept subservient. There were examples of toys that were given to children that subliminally reinforced I'm better than you and that you aren't even human. I know one of my students was looking at a toy that was a little black child that was being swallowed by an alligator. And this was a toy for a white child to play with, which reinforced the notion that this isn't a real person. You know, this is just an object. And the comments that the students were making too, and to me, I had a visceral disgust at seeing that. And it was good to see that my students also came to me with the same kind of feeling about how vile the whole thing was. But then we went into other parts of the exhibit, and this was a relatively small exhibit, and yet I found this one to be one of the more powerful exhibits when I was there. And you can see how blacks had to get along in a white society and how they could make an identity for themselves in entertainment and in sports, and use this as a way to build their sense of self-worth. But of course, the white man was still getting his cut of their, of their pay, and of course they couldn't stay where they were playing their music. They couldn't stay in those fancy hotels that they played in. they had to stay in those horrible places down the street or on the other side of town. So it then went to the emergence of the black identity in the civil rights movement and the rise of the Black Power movement and the rise of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and all of that. Now, most of my students and those of us who teach here know that most of our students aren't necessarily just black when it comes to this idea of race, that we have this huge multi-ethnic population. And here they were looking at American black experience. And some of them were saying, I never really thought about these issues in that way. I had 2 black students in my class, one of whom was from Ethiopia and the other of whom was from Haiti. So the American black experience was not necessarily deeply identified with them. And so that being the case, I looked at this racial identity issue with all of these exhibits that we had gone to that was focusing on, in the end, black identity. And I said, these kids have to take what they are feeling for that and translate it into something that they can identify with on their own terms. So they had to take the racial identity idea and translate it into some kind of identity issue that they could grab a hold of. Now, my class wasn't quite sure what to do with this because nobody gives students freedom to make their own projects in a class. You know, you will do what I tell you to do. And you know, as an artist, I'm all about giving them all the freedom that they can handle. So we did some supplemental readings, and we did the introduction to Glenn Lurie, I think his name is Lurie or Lowry, his book on One by One from the Inside Out. He's a conservative black man, and I considered myself all my life a flaming liberal, and I'm reconsidering that maybe I need to pull back from that a little bit and give more credence to the conservative black outlook on life. So that's the big thing that I learned from this. And Mark Dumbeck's blog essay on the long-term effects of bullying. Because the more I thought about identity issues, whenever people are coming up against identity issues, problems, whatever, one of the things that seems to come into play is bullying. You will do things my way. You do not have a say in how this goes. I am going to put you down in any way I can because I want the power and you can't have it. So I was looking for a broader rubric in which to give a context to all of the exhibits that we had gone to see, and something that could touch my students more personally, because again, I wanted them to make art. And to make art, they had to be viscerally interested in what they were doing. So with this diverse population, and many of the students not born in the country, and half of my students in my class were born in other countries, the history of slavery and the discovery of the black identity was interesting, but what in their own lives had the same kind of compelling meaning for them. Other students have been born after the civil rights era. My son, for example, does not have the same attitude towards the civil rights era that I do. For him, civil rights are a given. For me, it was something that we fought very hard for. And so, you know, with all of these things, again, what is going on in the world today that will make people respond the way I responded to the Black Civil Rights Movement? So last fall, the news was full of all kinds of reports that really made me depressed. I got to the point where I didn't want to look at TV anymore. Scapegoating of immigrant workers and migrant, illegal aliens. The use of social media by young people to destroy their contemporaries. Young children who were committing suicide because they couldn't handle the kind of brutal bullying that they were having to put up with cyberbullying in particular. growing religious intolerance in the United States and in other countries. Ease with which one group will willingly slaughter another. You know, when you look at the civil wars that are going on in the Sudan and different parts of Africa or Chechnya or whatever. Iran. So all of these topics put one group's identity in opposition to another group's identity. And it was a who's going to win kind of situation. And this got me to thinking about bullying. That if I looked at racism as a form of bullying, that it was one group imposing its will on another group and belittling them and taking away their identity in the process, then maybe my big umbrella could be bullying. And we took off from there. And that way each person had some kind of an experience with bullying in their lives, either personally or knew someone who had been bullied. And so they could take this and they could do something with it. Well, now we're back to the second half of my semester. And where am I going to put this? And I do a unit on language and color. So I said, well, we're going to take a word. We're going to take one of these words that people get bullied with. And, well, before I did that, I again did some research on bullying with the class. And we looked at verbal bullying, psychological bullying, physical bullying, and talked about what is bullying versus what is racism. And how are racism and bullying similar? How are they different? Is racism ever rationalized as being a good thing? Is bullying ever harmless? What are the short-term consequences of bullying, the long-term consequences? Is there a correlation between the effects of bullying and the effects of racism? And what are the warning signs of bullying and its long-term effects on males versus females? Because it turns out that females have a much more difficult time recovering from any kind of bullying than males do. So the students did some classroom exercises. I had them sit in groups and put together lists of words that they thought were offensive. And they sat there, and at first they didn't want to do this. And then they began to get into it a little bit more, and they came up with these long lists. And so then I was at the board and I said, somebody give me a word. Gave them a word. And what we ended up discovering was that these words seemed to fall into categories. And one of the major categories that received a lot of slurs was women. Isn't that interesting? And so you have these words, they get grouped, and now they're grouped, and they're going, oh, yeah, that's kind of interesting to see that this is happening. And then of course, race was another area where you got a lot of bullying terms. And did the symbolic exercise of attempting to eradicate a word on a piece of paper. Thank you, Michaele, for that suggestion. They wrote a word on a piece of paper. And I said to them, make the word go away, but you can't damage the paper. And they did, and eventually they figured, well, you can't do that, that there's no way that you can do that, and that is the whole point of bullying, that once that word is levied against you, it becomes a part of you, and you never get rid of it. So my assignment was sticks and stones, and I had them design a word. They had to invent a typeface that suggested the meaning of the word. And then they had to use psychological color to execute the word in paint. And then they had this word that was a horrible word. What were they going to do with it? They had to destroy it in some way. So we had a little ceremony where the words got destroyed. So here are some of the words. Some people were timid and they just went for ugly or fat. But then, some of my Spanish students got into wetback, and some of the women into whore and bitch and all of these things. So they finally started getting into it a little bit more. I love this bitch one. I think that's really cute. probably, I shouldn't say cute because bitches aren't cute, but nevertheless, I smile when I see this one. And then the small groups prepared their ways of ritually destroying the word, and they ended up all destroying it in the same way in the end. So I asked them to record whatever this destructive ritual was, whether they were going to tear it up or bury it until it rotted, or put it out on the sidewalks on campus and let people walk all over them until they were totally defaced. But they ended up all burning them in the end. And I asked them to record, which of course they didn't do very well, and post their results on YouTube. But a couple of my students got together and they did off-site a little bit of their own destroying, and it was a moderately successful project. But I discovered I had to trim my expectations. I just got so excited about this whole thing that it ended up eating enormous amounts of time up, which it shouldn't have. And I couldn't seem to move them forward fast enough, that they just kept lingering over certain things. I said, but we still have to do this. So, but we did learn some new technologies. They learned how to use iMovie or Movie Maker. I introduced them to Prezi as a presentation mechanism. We ran into big problems with my classroom having Macs, but they had PCs at home. So their PCs were not compatible, and so they couldn't work at home and bring it into class and work. So I ended up having to give them more class time to develop them in the classroom. But I'll work on it. I'll get this trimmed down. So the Smithsonian experience for my students. Some students had never been to the Smithsonian before, and they will return with their families and friends. The whole idea that it was free was just amazing to them. These museums we don't have to pay to get into. Whoa, I'll come here more often. So that was a big plus. Some had not realized the extent to which prejudice and slave-like conditions persisted into the 20th century still. They're all thinking of it as ancient history. Some were surprised to realize the subliminal messages sent by advertisers using African American images on their products. I had never made that connection of subservience before, the Aunt Jemima and other related images, or the dehumanizing elements of these toys that were given to children. Some were fascinated by the anthropology and the DNA, the more scientifically minded ones, and our humanoid ancestors, and we share so much of our DNA, particularly the Neanderthals, so that we have I forget what it is, what percentage of our DNA is Neanderthal. Students realized that they could make art. This was a big plus, and this is what I always go for in my class. When they call themselves an artist, I say, yes, I've got them now, and they'll never be the same again. So one student said the project that followed the field trip was fun, and I enjoyed a real art project that gave us an opportunity to be an artist and to paint personal words to express ourselves. And that's all I ever hope for in my class, is that I can get them to that point that they are in charge of their art making. So the Smithsonian experience for myself, I'll teach with a much broader palette. I have always used the Smithsonian, the National Gallery, and the other art galleries in my color class. And I've had my students go and I say, find a painting, sit down with a painting for an hour, make notes on all the things that I've taught you about color this year, write me a paper. And they do. But it had never occurred to me to look beyond the art aspect of the Smithsonian and to incorporate other aspects of these museums into my projects. This semester we're going to the American Indian Museum, and we're going to be examining masks, and they're going to come back and make a mask project. So I hope to teach more deeply than I have. I think I teach fairly deeply, but I may let some of the collateral stuff that I do in my class go and try to focus a little bit more focus a little bit more on more germane issues that relate to the class. It's provided an excellent opportunity for students and myself to think outside the box. So it's not just the students that I had thinking outside the box. I'm learning to think more outside the box too, and to generate more ideas for the classroom through visual examples in the museum that aren't directly related to my color field, and new ways to explore conceptual themes as art projects. So I want to give my gratitude to my students, first of all, for making this journey with me, and to my cohorts in the fellowship, because you've been great and I'm going to miss you all. And the Smithsonian curators and the support staff who were amazing. I am just so delighted to have been able to go behind the scenes and to experience everything that has gone on. So this experience has been worth all the extra work. And so here I have a few more of my students' projects and 2 of my students sitting in the Hall of Human Origins. And I do have one of their videos down here that I could play for you, but it's a little rough. I didn't get to edit it very much, and I probably talked enough, so I'm just going to close. Thank you all.